Law school. It's an investment in your future. But like all investments, without the right advice, it can lead to disaster. That's where PreLawPro comes in. Whether you're exploring the law, navigating the admissions process, or need personalized career guidance, at PreLawPro, we've got your back. Don't gamble on your future. Invest in it. Get started today at PreLawPro.com.
How can I make myself more competitive?
How do I build my network?
I want my career to go to the next level, but I don't really know where to start.
I hate the job I am in. What else can I do?
I want to work in healthcare, but I don't want to be a doctor.
I need connections in a new industry. Where should I start?
Whether you're a college student trying to decide on a career path, a young professional trying to develop their career, or maybe you're in the mid to late stages of your own professional journey and you're looking for a new challenge, or maybe you're facing an unexpected job search. Whoever you are, wherever you are, welcome to the Professionists podcast. And together, let's find your fit. Welcome back to another episode of the Professionists podcast. We've got a familiar guest. For those of you who have been working your way through Season 1, you'll recognise this week's guest from Episode 7, where we talked about financial planning for young professionals. Daniel Huizinga is back with us today. Danny, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. It's great to be back.
Danny, what did you study when you were in college?
Yeah, I went to Baylor University for undergrad, and I studied economics and finance in the business school. But then I also got minors in math and political science. So it was pretty busy during my undergrad years.
And you did a lot of writing, a lot of journalism during your college career too.
I did, yeah. Actually, one of my favorite facts is that I wrote in college probably 100, 150 articles. But I never actually took a journalism class. So I taught myself how to write like a journalist. And my editors also taught me with a lot of red ink what was good and bad journalistic writing. And so it's honestly started as a hobby, became something I really enjoyed. And although it never became a full-time career, at one point I thought it would be. And my life just took a different direction.
What was your motivation for studying those courses? Not the journalism side of things, but the business and the economics. What drew you to that?
I think when I think about, when I first made that decision about what to major in, going to Baylor, for me, I was always just interested in economics and kind of public life. I think politics is very different than public policy. And so I was always interested in the questions of how our government thinks about different politics and how, or different policies rather, and how that affects our world. And so the books that I read in my free time, even in high school, were often nonfiction books about the way people think. And for me, that was just a motivation to say, I want to dive into this a little bit more. I want to learn how the world works. And for the finance side, it was, I want to learn how companies work and demystify some of the language that you can see on the news, but it doesn't really make sense. And we talked, obviously, in the last episode a lot about investing. And I wanted to better understand the secrets, I guess, behind that world. And so that was a big motivator for me. And then the math minor was really on the urging of my advisor at Baylor. I did a lot of math in high school, was a few grades ahead, and I kind of was ready to be done, but my advisor said, trust me, it's worth it to build extra math skills, and really pushed me to do more advanced math courses at Baylor. And I'm so glad he did, because I think that just helped open my world again to more of these quantitative concepts that are so important in most careers today.
Well, the topic of today is to really explore the career path of a management consultant. But before we kind of jump into that, when did you discover that as a career path, and how did you find out about it?
That's a great question. I think later than most people in college probably do. I actually, like I said, for a while thought I wanted to be a journalist. And so all of my internships in college were in Washington, D.C., either working for Congress or for a think tank or for a news outlet. And I thought I was going to graduate, kind of plan to move to D.C. and figure it out. That's kind of what you do. And you find somewhere to sleep for a few months while you find a job. And I thought it would
surf where you can.
Exactly, right? I thought I would just be a political reporter and kind of start out making $30K a year or something and see what happened. So as I went through that process, spring of my senior year, I started getting a little nervous. It was a little bit difficult as all my friends in the business school were signing job offers to plan on this kind of career path in DC. And honestly, it was just the spring of that senior year where I got a random email from a consulting firm that was hiring. And they said, for whatever reason, we've identified you as a potential candidate and submit your resume here. And I submitted my resume. And then I started researching everything I could about what is management consulting. And the more I learned, I thought, this actually sounds like an interesting career that I've never really considered. And after I went through the interview process, I completely threw off that DC plan and thought, I'm going to do this first. So it was not at all this kind of grand master plan over my 4 years. It was more of a last minute change in my career path.
If you had to write a book about the profession of a management consultant, what would you call it?
I think I would call the book "It Depends," which is the answer that someone gives you whenever you're asked what is consulting. They'll tell you it depends. So I think that's probably a good way to start, and something that everyone in the industry would definitely resonate with right away.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have heard of management consulting, but I mean, what on earth is it?
Well, it depends. but the real answer, I think, is in a nutshell, right? You go to a company or an organization or a government that's having a tough problem that they're unable to solve themselves for whatever reason. Either they don't have the knowledge or the expertise, or they don't have the time.
Fresh perspective, maybe?
Exactly, right. Or they've been working on it for so long, they can't figure out really what to do next. You know, sometimes maybe they have an idea of what they want to do, but they need some validation. And so they bring in consultants from anywhere from a few weeks to maybe even a few years for some longer projects. And your goal is to come in, learn what they're trying to do, pull in tons of research, do analysis, either quantitative analysis, building models and kind of running analytics that they might not be able to do, but also strategic analysis. So we use a lot of PowerPoint as well and try to help take all of the complexities of a business or an organization and distill down to the key decisions they need to make, and a framework for them to think through what are the pros and cons of different decisions, who's going to be affected, how might this impact your financials over the next few years, what will investors think, things like that. And it's helping to organize kind of everybody's opinions and ideas and analysis into one place so that ultimately they feel more confident about what to do next. And so a lot of consulting falls into that framework in some way, and there's a ton of different ways that companies actually do that. But really, that's what you're doing, is just bringing all that insight and kind of organization capability to a place that needs it for a short or limited period of time and can't do it with their existing employees.
And is it one of those jobs where you are in an office at a central location, or is it kind of like audit in accounting where you will actually go out to the client's offices in Kansas City, even though you might be based in Houston or whatever the case may be? What does that look like?
Yeah, pre-COVID, it was definitely travel heavy. Many of these consulting firms are known for having people be on the road 3 nights a week. So my first project, for example, I started in the Boston office, and 4 a.m. Monday morning, I was in an Uber to the airport to get on a plane to middle of nowhere in New Jersey. And I'd fly to New Jersey, go to the client's office. And so it was an insurance company in New Jersey, of which there are many. And I would work at the client's office for 4 days, stay in a hotel just down the street. And then Thursday afternoon around 5 o'clock, I would leave and go back to the airport, fly home, eventually get back home in Boston, probably like 8 or 9 p.m. if there were no flight delays, which was probably half the time. And then Friday, I would work from home usually, which was a nice break. But sometimes you would actually go into the consulting firm's office in Boston if you wanted to see other people who had all been in different cities and states across the country. But that at least provided 1 day a week to have some community with coworkers who actually lived in the same city you did. But if you didn't do that, it can be kind of isolating. And I think post-COVID especially, we're trying to figure out now what the industry will look like as far as travel. It's been remote, obviously, for a year. And I think after this, we might have some lower travel, maybe 2 or 3 nights a week, but it still is so important to be in the client's office working with them. You usually have one conference room and there's 5 or 10 of you packed in this conference room, and that's your office for the whole week. it's a weird environment.
Well, I guess as a management consultant too, it's it's management consulting, which means to some degree you have to be there and see it rather than just crunching numbers, but actually maybe is there some leadership consulting that's part of that as well, like kind of identifying maybe some bottlenecks and some inefficiencies in leadership as well?
I think implicitly, not explicitly in the contracts often, do they want you to kind of do like leadership coaching for some of the executives? But I think very quickly you start learning who are the people who are innovative and creative and driven and willing to get things done, and who are the people at the company who are throwing up roadblocks and trying to slow things down and making your life difficult. And there is a lot of very careful, tactful decisions you have to make with different strong personalities. I mean, a lot of people are skeptical right away when you show up and you're trying to help make sense of things and give them advice, and you're adding more work to their plate because they have to send you data and give you information and answer tons of questions that you have in that first week or two. And so you really have to build a lot of trust and help them feel that you are there to help and you will make their life easier, but they need to invest in you first. And I think some employees are more willing to do that than others. And it's a lot easier if you're in person and you can all go out to dinner that first week. And often when we have these consulting projects, we invest a lot in dinners and social outings, not just for the consulting team, but also with the client, because the goal is to build friendship and community among people so that you trust each other and you help each other out. You're not fighting every day. So that's been a challenge, I think, post-COVID is, no one wants to do a virtual whatever dinner at 7 p.m. after working all day. And so it's just been a little harder, I think, to navigate that community aspect in the pandemic.
You mentioned earlier just the amount of travel that you were doing. And I think when you were coming out of college, that sounds really exciting until you've done it for a little while. And you get really sick and tired of living out of a suitcase, and hotels aren't as glamorous as they might sound. You started out as an analyst, as I understand things. So help us understand, did that travel requirement, would that have followed you throughout your career, or is it one of these things that the more senior you get, the less travel you have to do?
Yeah, actually, I think the amount of travel is actually relatively consistent at many firms. Again, it depends, right? But as an analyst, you have much less power in where you go and what project you're on. And so as a new analyst at my firm, I basically got an email that said, you're going to this insurance company on Monday and here's your flights. And that's, you don't get to negotiate, right? That's what you're doing. So, for 6 months, I was on that project with that company until I was on another one. And that one I had a little more say. I had found a good manager that I wanted to be with and switch. And that was a project in Maryland. And then as I built a network and community, I could start controlling a little bit more where I was traveling and what I wanted to do. But even the most senior people are still often traveling 3 or 4 days a week, sometimes more, just because as you get more senior, they start spreading you out across different projects. So as an analyst, I was on one project, full time every week. If you're a managing director or partner, the phrase changes depending on the firm you're at. But if you're one of those senior people, you're perhaps 25% on 4 projects, or you're supervising kind of 8 different projects, and you're traveling all the time to different cities for a few hours just to check in on the team, meet with the client, and then you're on the plane the same day going somewhere else. And so in some ways, I think it can be more exhausting as you get more senior, and that's why a lot of people don't last too long. The typical amount of time that someone stays out of undergrad is just a few years, usually 2 to 4 years, and then people kind of get burned out by that travel. It sounds, like you said, it sounds fun at the beginning, but then you're in a middle of nowhere, Courtyard Marriott hotel with nothing to do, and you're just working all night. Then it's not really that luxurious anymore when your friends are sending you pictures from back home, or your family, of course. Then you just feel like you're actually missing out on the people you care about.
Were you single when you started this job? Because you're a dad now. I imagine it's very, very hard to have a relationship while you're on the road so frequently.
I was lucky in that I actually had a long distance relationship. My wife was a teacher on the other side of the country. So for me, this was actually the best possible situation, because I would fly to New Jersey and then the company would actually allow me to fly to Arizona where she was working. And that was part of the expense. If the flight was any more expensive than going back home, I would have to pay the difference. But for me, it was still a lot easier than having to pay for an entire flight from Boston to Arizona. So it made our long distance relationship easier because I could visit and see her a lot more. And it didn't really matter that I was in Boston 2 weekends a month. My roommates kind of didn't mind because I paid rent and was never there. So, for me, I think that actually worked out. If you had a partner at home, and especially a kid, I think that's where it gets really challenging. And that leads to the 3 to 5 year time frame too, as people start getting more serious in relationships or family, and perhaps figuring out more what type of work they want to do. This kind of try everything, fly around, test out different types of industries becomes less appealing. And that's why people kind of gravitate out of consulting, because it can get exhausting. And especially if you're not able to shut off your computer and give yourself a break, it can consume you 24/7. And you really have to be careful about, setting boundaries for yourself so that you're not so consumed by this work that you leave out every aspect of your personal life.
Yeah, I think that's an important piece of it. I do want to jump into kind of the day-to-day aspects of your role. But before we do that, you mentioned that the life cycle is usually that kind of 3 to 5 years before people move on to something else. What do they move on to?
It's interesting as I think about where my friends have gone. Some as soon as a year and a half after we started together. Some are still working at the firm 6.5 years in. I left at about 5.5 years. So I think one of the most common path is to get an MBA at a good business school, which is obviously the path I took. So I'm a student right now at Chicago Booth, which is the University of Chicago's MBA program. And that's a common path because usually after a few years, you're the perfect age to jump right into these programs. It's good, relevant experience. And then again, you have the world open to you. There's a ton of things you can do after the MBA. So it's tough to say quantitatively, but it seems like at least a third, a half of my colleagues who left did that or another graduate program. I'd say a fair number also join a startup or like a smaller consulting firm as well. So they perhaps like kind of the exciting, similar type of work, but they want to work for a place that isn't hundreds of thousands of employees, in the case of my last firm, and they want to be able to have a little smaller group. And then some people, of course, actually go to either clients we worked with or companies in a similar industry. So if you've worked a lot with banks or with healthcare companies or something, you've built a lot of industry knowledge, and those companies will often hire you at a solid manager role where you have that expertise, you have the ability to manage and lead teams and to do research very quickly, and that's appealing to them. And so some of my friends have kind of jumped off in that route as well, where you get a little more work-life balance and you're not traveling all the time, but you still come in then with some experience that allows you to maybe come a few levels higher than if you went right out of undergrad to one of those companies.
So it sounds like even though the turnover rate is fairly high, the experience that you get in return for the ups and downs of that lifestyle is that you have this really unique set of skills and experiences that are transferable to moving to a more managerial role within a different industry, or going off and getting your MBA in order to make that similar shift.
Yeah, I think a good quote that people say often is that consulting is a great job if you're not sure what you want to do yet. And so I think for a lot of college students, and you're not quite sure what you might like, this is a way to delay this decision a little bit. Try a bunch of things in the real world, not just in a classroom, and figure out what type of work do you like, what types of clients do you like, do you enjoy the travel? Some of my friends still love traveling every week. Some of them realize that they can't stand it and they need to find a place where they don't have to travel. I think I'm somewhere in the middle. But yeah, it's a good way to explore and not have to close any doors yet. Consulting still keeps a lot of those different paths open, and you can keep evaluating and thinking about what do you want to do next. And I've seen, people from consulting go any different path, anywhere from all those things I mentioned to doing crazy things like going to work in government or at a nonprofit or being a teacher. And so it doesn't really stop you from changing your mind 2 or 3 years later. And then you've made a little money, you've built some experience that is applicable anywhere. Being able to solve problems is a good transferable skill at any organization.
To just turn to the different roles that you had within Accenture during your time there, you were an analyst, you were a management consultant, and then you were a manager. Help us understand the difference between those three roles.
I loved often giving advice to Baylor students and others who would ask kind of about how that progression worked. So when you're an analyst, and at other firms you might see this is called something like an associate. Every company has their own terminology to make your life more confusing. But the entry level out of college role is usually mostly a learning experience for you. I mean, right away you have work to do, but the company's not expecting you to go advise a CEO on how to run his or her business because they know you're just out of college. But what we really need analysts to do is to get into the weeds and pull together the details that make up the analysis and the recommendations that ultimately do go up to the CEOs and other people who ask for our advice. And so as an analyst right away, I mean, sometimes my jobs were, taking a huge Excel data set and trying to figure out how to make an interactive dashboard that showed the trend of where things were going. Or it was, hey, here's 20 different, research papers or annual reports or different sources on competitive analysis. Like, what are the 5 key things to know from this and how can I distill this down? Or it was sitting in meetings and people are discussing 7 or 8 things they want to do and what needs to be done next. And they honestly just needed me to put together the timeline and the visual. And then every week follow up with people who had signed up to do different things and made sure they get done. So you're kind of a jack of all trades. And in some ways you're doing things for your client because they have problems and things that they need you to analyze. But you also have a manager from your firm that's asking you to do things as well. And so you always have a list of kind of things to do, but the best analysts are ones who also anticipate ways to make things better. So as you're working on something, if you see a process is not going well, or you are reading through a presentation we're about to do and you think we could tell the story a little better or make the visuals better, the analysts who get promoted quickly are ones who say, hey, I made a new version of this slide, or hey, I improved this model so that it takes us a shorter time to update. What do you think? And those are the people that bosses say, hey, like, this is someone who's not just doing exactly what I spelled out, but is seeking out ways to make things better. So then I guess just very quickly going up that chain. So as a consultant, you've been there 2 or 3 years, you know the language, you're expected to start directing analysts and helping them know what to do to keep them busy, and also starting to lead some of your own meetings. So as a consultant, you're often the one putting together a meeting with the client, setting the agenda, telling them what they need. And at that point, your boss expects that you can kind of go and do that without them sitting in the room, which is a great way to start building confidence. And then as a manager is where you start leading entire work streams, sections of a project, or even maybe a small project. As a manager, I led a project of 4 people. And so then you're really the main full-time contact for whatever the client needs. And that's everything from responding to all the requests they have and making sure your team is busy, but also starting to manage things like sales and invoicing, making sure we're getting paid on time, planning schedules and vacations and all this other stuff that takes up your time too. So as you start moving up, you see your job change, but it still all evolves around, I think, that kind of communication, problem solving, organizational skills that really weave through it all.
And as a manager?
Yeah. So the manager, I think, was that last one, right, where it's just kind of leading that project, leading the team, and thinking more about strategically, like, how do we grow our presence at the client, and how do we anticipate future projects that they might need, and starting to work with managing directors, partners to sell additional opportunities for our firm.
And had you stayed there, what would be the next rung up?
Yeah, at my firm, it would have been senior manager. And again, different firms call this differently. A lot of companies, the manager role is called a project leader or engagement manager. And then after that, instead of senior manager, they'll call it principal or something.
Okay.
And then you have associate partner. At my firm, it was senior manager, then managing director. So you kind of have to read between the lines here, but it's all kind of a similar progression and similar time frame. Each promotion is usually about 2 or 3 years until you kind of get to that next level. And it all depends, again, are you showing initiative and really finding ways to stand out on your own? Because there are never really clear job responsibilities. It's all about how much are you taking action and finding ways to impress the client and impress your manager.
And talk to us a little bit about the hours, because you mentioned, for example, that you'd get up at 4:00 and you'd be in an Uber off to the airport to go from Boston to Jersey. That makes for a very, very long day. And it sounds like a lot of the work carried on into the evenings as you were building relationships and credibility with your clients. Was there an understanding that in return for putting in those extra hours, you had a little bit more flexibility in terms of periods where you weren't on the road, or maybe the Friday you didn't have to come in until midday? Or was it just the expectation was, hey, this is what we do and this is how it's done, and get on board and we'll move on?
I think one of the biggest benefits of consulting is that flexibility. And so, yes, the hours are long. I'd say, so right, the 4 a.m. Monday morning is tough, especially that night. But, on a day when I woke up in the hotel, for example, I would usually try to get to the client's office by 8:30 and usually be there until at least 6 or 7, and then would go back to the hotel, usually have an hour, like take a break, either work out, have dinner or something like that. But often I would still be working then for a few hours that night, partly because there's a lot to do and there's a short time frame and a lot of pressure, partly because you have nothing else to do. You're at a hotel in the middle of nowhere and you have no friends around, and so everyone just kind of works. Thursdays are kind of nice because you leave at 4 or 5 to catch the flight, and then you're usually not working much Thursday night. That's your chance to unpack and do laundry and everything. But like you said, the Fridays are a good chance to kind of reset a little bit, spend some time doing things with coworkers in your office, and usually by 5 o'clock people are out on Friday to either do a happy hour or just kind of start their weekend. But again, it depends. There were some weeks where, depending on what the timelines look like, we're waiting for a contract to be signed or something, I would have a week where there was really little to do. And then, you can kind of work from home, go run errands, do whatever you want during the day. And then there were some weekends where I was working weekends and working till midnight, for weeks on end, trying to get something done in time. And we're having calls at 10 p.m. trying to get everybody together. So it's unpredictable sometimes, which is tough. But like I said at the beginning, this flexibility is a huge key in that even as an analyst, no one's telling you must come to the office at this time or sign on at this time. It's people are really trusting you to own and manage your schedule. And if you're struggling or you're not doing well enough, you'll hear about it. But we treat you as adults right away. And that's, I think, a refreshing thing, that you're not timed for which hours you're logged on to your computer or anything like that. And if you need to run out to do something in the middle of the day, that's usually totally fine as long as your work doesn't suffer. You don't have to ask permission to run to the grocery store or whatever. So that's refreshing for a lot of people.
Well, that was going to be a follow-up question is, lawyers and accountants charge, in 6-minute or 15-minute increments depending on the firm. It sounds like you're paid a salary and you're expected to do a project and to do it for as long as it needs to be done, as opposed to, hey, you've got to bill 7 hours a day while you're at the client.
Yeah, and that differs a lot by firms as well,
Okay.
and even within firms based on the project. So some firms have a more regimented kind of hourly billing structure, especially if you're working on multiple projects, you have to keep track. Economic consulting firms, for example, which are a little bit different. They're more kind of statistical, analytical firms that work often with law firms and big companies. Those are much more, I think, regimented on those 6 or 12-minute increments of what you're spending your time doing. At least at my firm, for the projects I was on, they were usually sold at a fixed fee, which means the clients agreed to pay X $1,000 for this many weeks of these people. They know, which team members they're getting. And so, there's some set deliverables that, and by deliverable, I mean a presentation or a model or some type of analysis that they wanted. And as long as they get those, they're happy. And so no one's saying, well, did you spend 52.6 hours or 57.3 hours on this and which days? It's as long as it's getting done, that's the important thing. And so there's a little less pressure throughout the day of oh, you have 14 minutes for lunch right now. You need to make sure to log that. And it was a lot easier to focus on doing good work rather than putting in every little increment of time. But some firms are a little more strict on that because of the way they bill. And so it's a good question to ask whenever you're interviewing for a job, because I think there's some estimates that consultants can spend up to a few hours a week putting their time in if it's too detailed. And so you really want to think about how much are you going to have to actually be micromanaged that way versus getting the freedom to just know, hey, you're full-time on this project and can do good work.
Is there any kind of licensing requirement? Like law, for example, you have to pass the bar exam. Is there a qualification that you need to obtain to be a management consultant, or is it more skill set and experience?
I think that's one of the great things about the industry is that anyone can really do it. I remember even thinking about my starting class, probably half were in my starting class at the firm. Half were engineers, maybe roughly half were business students, and then there was a sprinkling of other liberal arts majors, music and English major, and other people like me, I guess, in those final months before graduation, who suddenly found consulting and thought, why not? And clearly did a great job in the interview and impressed the recruiter. So what's exciting about this career is you don't have to go to grad school to be able to do it, and you don't have to have any specific technical knowledge necessarily. Often when you start, really what we were looking for is that drive and initiative, which is a lot harder to find than you might think. A lot of people, even the people we hire, turn out to be people who don't actually do things unless you tell them exactly what to do. And that doesn't make the model work for us. The only way it works is if you're seeking out things on the ground that can help the client that your manager might not know about. So it's people with that drive and also people who are comfortable with ambiguity. And so sometimes those English majors are actually really good because when they're confronted with a blank dry erase board, they don't freeze up and say, well, where do I start? They're able to say, well, let's structure this like I would write a story. Or for me, it was like I would write an article. How do I break down the parts of this problem? And it seems really overwhelming and complex, but here's the 6 aspects that I'll need, and here's 2 data sources for each one that I'll need to look into, and which one should I do first and prioritize. And as you break it down, it gets actually quite manageable, especially when you have a team of smart, driven people. And it just grows from there. And I think what they want is people, even in those first few months, who are not afraid to just take a shot and try something and are confident enough to put themselves out there, but also not too arrogant that they're know-it-alls, because you have to realize that you don't know much at all in those first few years and that you can learn a lot from the smart people around you.
Is it one of those jobs? Certainly, as I was a young professional, it had a reputation as being a really well-paid industry. Is the 6-figure mark something that people can hit fairly early in their career?
Definitely. And depending on firm, you can look a lot of this up as well. There's a consulting channel on Reddit, and there's I think a site, managementconsulted.com, that aggregates a lot of this info. But yeah, it's been 6 years now since I started out of college, but at least I would guess for recent college graduates now coming into consulting firms, it could be in that first year anywhere from $75,000 to $100,000 in that first year, once you include bonuses and stuff as well. Maybe
and
even
the
a little
city
more.
too, I'm guessing, probably has a factor.
You're right, exactly. Yeah, if you're living in LA or New York, you definitely get an extra bump. They also usually give you a signing bonus and relocation bonus out of undergrad, which is really nice to start out with some cash. And the good thing about these firms too is, many large companies give raises of a few percent per year. Consulting firms, you can get raises of, more like 10 or 15% a year, depending on how well you're doing. Sometimes less. It depends on, of course, how the business is doing. But then when you get those big promotions, you often get a raise of 30, 40%. And that can be a really shocking thing too. But very quickly you can hit that 6-figure mark within a few years. And it's just a great way to start saving and kind of building up that retirement and all that stuff we talked about in the last episode. So that if you want to do something different afterwards, you're a little more comfortable.
It sounds like it's got a lot of flexibility to it. I wonder, are there many opportunities to travel abroad? Are there opportunities to go and work as a management consultant in Europe or in Asia? Or are you fairly limited to the United States?
To me, I guess I would say it's all relative to what you compare it to. So it is not common to be able to go internationally, partly because of visa problems and honestly language barrier, of course, makes it hard for you to be very effective in a country you don't speak the language. However, if you compare it to other big companies, you're much more likely to have an opportunity to travel at some point in your career, especially in those few years. Then a big company where you're barely traveling, they likely have no reason to send you abroad. But But in consulting, as long as you meet someone from that country and can make a case of why you would be a great person on the team, it's totally doable. I had a chance to go to a few countries in South America for a project, which was a lot of fun, with people from our firm who worked full-time in those offices in South America, which is great because then they can take you to the restaurants and they speak the language and it made it a lot more fun.
Yeah.
But I also had a friend who went and lived in London for 6 months. He got on a project in London and the company paid for him to have a house there, and he was 2 years out of college. So,
wow.
That's an option too. And I had a friend who traveled around Asia for 3 months because the client they were at needed him to help roll out a new technology at a bunch of their offices in Asia. So, it's definitely not the most common thing, but if you really want to do it, those are some great examples of people, even just a few years out of college, who made it work and really learned a lot, I think, just about how the world works and about different cultures and experiences in a way that will stick with them for the rest of their lives, kind of similar to study abroad. I mean, it's great to do study abroad and get paid for it. Of course, you're still in an office all day, which is still exhausting, but it is fun at night to explore somewhere you've never been.
Yeah. When you think back, is there anything that you would do differently in your career?
That's a great question. I think as I think back, I would have potentially been a little less dramatic about how much I felt like I was stuck. I think sometimes I often fool myself into thinking, I don't like this project, or I don't like what I'm working on right now. Like I'm going to be doing this forever. Like I think I often got too disappointed maybe with where I thought I would, or maybe too prescriptive with where I thought I would be. And the reality is, now that I look back on the 6 or so years that I was in consulting before my MBA, I realized I learned a lot from all those tough experiences. And I think just recognizing in each situation, hey, I can learn a lot from this, and I don't have to always be thinking about what the next thing would be.
It's easy to be impatient early in your career, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I also think it did take me a while to figure out what I wanted to my personal brand to be within the firm. I think that's something really in any job, but especially in consulting, you're always meeting people, you're always kind of networking and always kind of interviewing for your next project, because you don't know when that's going to be, and you want to have a network of people who you can email and pull you onto something cool. So I think I would have just tried to figure out a little earlier what I wanted to become known for. It ended up being, I became kind of the data analytics person within our education practice. So we worked a lot with schools, universities, and nonprofits. And once I kind of found that niche and found that I was good at that and that I enjoyed it, people started coming to me with a lot of cool, interesting opportunities, and I became something of an expert in that space and was speaking on calls to other consultants, speaking to clients in sales meetings. And that was just a great way for me to demonstrate expertise and passion and do something that I cared about. But it took me a while to figure out what that is. And to some degree, that's just part of the process too. You try some things, you figure out what you love doing and what it is that at 10 p.m. in the hotel you end up spending your free time on, and you start gravitating towards the other people who share those interests. And, once that happens, I think the job becomes a lot more rewarding because you feel like you're getting to do what you want. And even though there's long hours, it feels like, hey, this is the place that I am excited to be at every day. And this is stuff that I love learning about. And I'd say it took me 2 years to really kind of settle into that. And the job just got a ton better after that.
You were at Accenture, but who are the big players? Because I think when we think of accounting, we think of the big four. But who are the major players in the management consulting space? Yeah,
so you're totally right. The big four is definitely those accounting firms. So PwC, EY, KPMG, and Deloitte. And all of them do have consulting branches as well. Deloitte especially competes a lot with Accenture, where I was. Accenture actually doesn't have an accounting side, so they're a little unique there. They used to. They used to be called Andersen Consulting, which is part of Arthur Andersen, a big accounting firm that did accounting for Enron. And when that whole scandal blew up, then they separated. So that's where we are now. But yeah, so those four accounting firms definitely have consulting practices, but they're a little bit limited in that there are some restrictions about they can't consult for companies they're auditing and things like that. So it makes it a little harder for them. And definitely I'd say they're a little more like financial focused. Accenture is really big in technology. We do a lot of artificial intelligence stuff. And globally, we have almost 500,000 employees. So I think just headcount wise were massive.
Yeah.
And IBM is kind of in that technology consulting space as well. But when you think more broadly, like stepping out from those big companies you might have heard of, really the elite strategy consulting firms are what people think of a lot, especially coming out of MBA programs. For undergrad, they mostly recruit at the Ivy League schools, and then again for the top MBA program. So the top three in that space are what people call MBB, which is McKinsey, BCG, Boston Consulting Group, and Bain. And the three of those really dominate the kind of highest paid elite strategy work of management consulting. And they have been for a while, for the last 50 years or so. Like those have been kind of the three names. And so coming out of business school too, that's often the target for a lot of people when they want to go into consulting is, those firms, even from my business school, those three together hire about 100 of the 600 graduates each year from my business school program. So they're some of the top employers and really have built this reputation and prestige over many years of doing often more of those like higher level strategy, like a few week or few month projects, whereas Accenture does a whole ton of things, but focuses more sometimes on maybe 2 or 3 year projects, often big technology implementations, and pulls in people from around the world with more technical expertise to actually get systems set up and things like that. So there's value in all of it, and all of those firms are starting to cross over. Accenture is starting to do a lot more strategy work, and the MBBs are starting to do a lot of technology work as well as the lines get blurred in this industry. But hopefully that gives you just a sense of kind of the major players. And then in any city, there are a ton of other smaller firms as well. As people leave these firms, they start their own and hire 10 or 20 people and charge a lot less. And so as long as you have kind of a good reputation, you can do that pretty effectively, and you'll find tons of small little firms that pay still very well and give you an opportunity to learn the trade.
Do you see yourself going into consulting in some capacity after your MBA program, or do you think you might go in a different direction?
I think so. I really did enjoy the 5.5 years before business school and feel like I learned a lot, and in many ways the job matched, I think, my personality, my willingness to jump in and try to make things better in any way I can. And so for me, it's coming to business school was not a chance to get away from this job. It is exhausting. It is frustrating sometimes, like any job, but I felt that I was more invigorated and more rewarded than I was frustrated. And so as long as the good outweighs the bad, you stick around. But for me, business school, I think, provides the opportunity just to reset a little bit. I just had a kid, so it's a great chance to spend some time with him and learn a lot, build a bigger network in Chicago, where I am now. But I this summer will be interning for BCG, Boston Consulting Group. So that's just a 10-week internship this summer. And then, we'll still evaluate what to do once I graduate in a little over a year. But really excited this summer about just taking that opportunity to learn and dive in an industry that I feel like I know pretty well, but with, again, a whole new set of smart people on new, interesting problems that I'm really excited just to see how they do it. I think it'll be a great experience.
Yeah. Well, before we started the episode, you and I had an off-mic conversation, and I mentioned that I'm a big fan of the work of Richard and Daniel Huizinga, in particular, a book called The Future of the Professions. And so in that book, they do address some of the changes that they anticipate are going to hit some major industries: law, accounting, medicine, law, medicine, accounting, and they mention management consulting. Where do you see that industry changing and evolving in the next 10 to 15 years?
I think it's a great question and something that people are talking about a lot, and can share some articles after this as well, just on how people are thinking about this disruption of management consulting. I think,
and they'll be in the show notes too, people. If you do want to go back and have a look at some of these articles that Danny's referring to, they'll be in the show notes. Perfect.
Yeah, and I think especially with COVID now too, I think these articles that were published before the pandemic are now being reevaluated as well. It's interesting in that I think the pandemic has actually created and potentially accelerated some of the changes that we've seen, while also maybe proving wrong some of these assumptions. So I think in general, in the last decade, people have projected that management consulting to some degree is going to change a lot for a few reasons. I think One is that the old model used to be that data was pretty hard to get, and expertise, before the internet, of course, like you really did need to pay one of these firms a ton of money to do analysis and even bring you competitors' data and help you look at where you were in the market, because you couldn't really look that up. You didn't really have a way to benchmark very easily. It cost a lot of money. Now that kind of anyone can do that in-house, and now especially big corporations are hiring their own in-house strategy people from these MBA programs, and they're hiring their own analytics people and technology experts. They don't really need people to do that. What they need consultants for now, in my experience, is when they're launching something new, or that they haven't done before, or they're really trying to reevaluate a program that is struggling and they don't know how to turn it around and everything they've tried isn't working, or they really need to put in a new technology and they have no idea how it works. For them, in those situations, if they don't have the employees that have the time or the knowledge to do it, it's a lot cheaper, honestly, to hire consultants, even though it seems crazy to pay these firms a few $100,000 for a month or two of work, because they only need them for a month or two sometimes to give them that expertise, get something set up, give them the direction, and then they leave. They often can't, especially if they're in a kind of remote, middle of nowhere place, they can't find the right talent and convince people to move there and work there full time when they really only need them for a month or two. So I think you still will see a huge role for these firms on helping those kind of specific one-off kind of advisory opportunities. But many of these firms still have long relationships with clients as well. And so maybe they're not always on site working, but as they do projects, even a few times a year, they build these long-term relationships, and it allows them to kind of come in when they're needed. And then you don't have to pay them when they're not there. And then they can come back whenever you have something else, but you still have a continuity of people who know your business and who perhaps have worked at other companies. Whereas many people at the big companies have worked there for 10, 20 years. It's nice to have a consultant who maybe has worked at 7 of your competitors too. And of course, you can't give specific information, right? There's a lot of rules to protect there, but it is helpful to have someone who knows like what is going on in the industry as a whole, and bring in some of that fresh expertise. I think, even in my experience writing articles, sometimes I needed to take a break and come back the next day with fresh eyes, and I would find parts of my article that I thought I completely needed to rewrite. And it's the same way here. I think sometimes you just need to have people who haven't been working on something for a long time come and look at it a new way and say, hey, what if you tried this? And it, as crazy as that sounds, it actually works very well in shaking up the way these companies think. So
I guess on the back of that, we talked about your trajectory from undergrad into management consulting, and now you worked there for a little while and then into business school and potentially returning to management consulting. Is it possible for people to enter the industry a little later? Let's say someone has been off doing some other professional role, but they have that analytical mind. They enjoy the qualitative and quantitative aspects of reviewing data, and maybe they haven't been working in management consulting, but they've listened to this and gone, this sounds interesting. A, can they break into it? And B, what would be your advice for them to go about exploring it and making that transition?
Yeah, absolutely. I can think of a number of personal examples of people who joined consulting even without going to business school, just, in their mid-20s or even in their early 30s. And often the challenge you just have to keep in mind is consulting firms value consulting experience especially. So at least at Accenture, even if you had a few years of experience in something completely unrelated, as a teacher or even sometimes at a company, they'd still want you to come at that analyst level because they want you to learn how the consulting business works. It's different than any other job. But we hire people all the time. We call them, it depends. We hire people to those roles. We'd also hire experienced hires, which means maybe you'd come in at a consultant role or at a manager role if you've really had specialized experience in a specific industry and you wanted to keep doing that. We'd be happy to hire you and have you work with those types of clients as well. But even I can think of people who had no business experience whatsoever and thought this would be interesting, and now they love it and they've been in consulting for a long time. So it's totally open and possible. It's just a little harder because there isn't campus recruiting. And so the key for those people, I would always say, is applying on the website is probably going to get you pretty much nowhere. What you need to do is honestly find people in your network who are doing it. Look on LinkedIn, look up a few of these firm names, and just try to get coffee with them for 20 minutes. Ask what their job's like, ask what they like and don't like about it. And the more you can get to know those people, they're able to refer you and connect you to the people perhaps who are actually making the hiring decisions. And ultimately, that's what gives you the chance to break in. It's not, going through the algorithm, the application site is almost guaranteed to fail. I mean, there's just way too many people, and it's not a good way to stand out.
You are preaching to the choir, Danny. If you've listened to any number of episodes so far in season 1, you will have heard the term informational interview mentioned over and over and over, pretty much in every episode, because it is a low-cost, high-return exercise if you're willing to put in the time and effort. This has been a really interesting exploration of an exciting and interesting career that I think a lot of people know is out there but don't know a heck of a lot about. So, Danny, thank you for taking the time to join us again on The Professionists and to explore the career of a management consultant.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and good luck to all of you who decide to jump into this path.
Thanks again. Now, if you have enjoyed this week's episode, go on over to www.theprofessionists.com. You can subscribe to the podcast there. You can also go ahead and check out our blog. We are on Instagram at The Professionists. And please go ahead and leave us a review on whichever platform that you are using to listen to the podcast, because it really does help us get the podcast up there and in front of more people, and hopefully to bring you more guests like Danny. Thanks again for joining us, Danny.
Thank you. Have a great day.